Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in loving honor and memory of Yosef Halevi Weinberg, Olav Shalom, and Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz, Olav Shalom. It's also in the schus of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz. And I would also like to wish a mazel tov to their son, Yossi and Nachamadina Katz, upon the engagement of their son Mendel to Mushka Blooming. Special mention that this program, this class, is especially dedicated to our brethren, our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, who are now under fire. Hashem should protect them. We are told that Eretz Asher Eni Hashem Elokecha Ba Mereshish Hashana V'ad Achri Shana. God is special providence and protection over the people in Eretz Yisrael, completely protected, the cessation of all violence. Should be emes shalom, sati shalom ba'aretz, as we march toward Matan Torah, and above all the geula hamitis v'ashlema. We're up to the end of Perek Aleph, the end of chapter 1 in Tanya, the last few lines. So let's put them in context and continue our learning. The first half of the chapter primarily was focused on the establishing the idea of a tzaddik and a rasha, that each of us is sent to this world to be a tzaddik and not to be the opposite. We're given an oath and we're empowered to do so. The Alter Rebbe continued with a series of questions to analyze what does this mean to be a rasha? What does it mean to be a tzaddik? Introducing the intermediary, the Beinani. Series of questions which we learned in detail. After these questions, the Alter Rebbe said, to understand all this, let us begin, and he quotes from Rab Chaim Vital, in Shari Kedusha, that every Jew has two nefoshes, has two souls. Two souls. Nefesh Elokis and Nefesh Abamis. Those will be the words used later. He doesn't say that right away. The divine soul, the animal soul. But he begins the other way, with the animal soul. A nefesh that's rooted in klippas nega. And we explained what that means. Klippa is a shell. It's rooted in a level of the divine that is concealed like a fruit within a shell, thus allowing the possibility for us to misunderstand and focus more on the shell than on the fruit. That's called klippas nega. We're going to have a lot more elaboration on that later in chapters 6 and 7 in Tanya. But the Alter Rebbe established that because essentially everything, just like we have tzaddik and rasha, we also have these two paths, these two choices in our lives. But now we're not talking about choice, we're talking about the very essence and the very DNA, so to speak, of this nefesh achas, which he defines coming from klippas nega. And from there is rooted all the negative characteristics and features that a human being can have. From the four, you say the saroim, what he called the negative elements. But from there is also rooted the midas tevis of the nefesh habamis, as he said. That we have from this also the tev nefesh habamis. And he gave from the Gemara the example of that Eden have the nature of being gemli chasodim and rachmanim. And that's from the animal soul. Because remember, klippas nega is not evil. It's tevara, as he said, the sod of the eitz hadas, tevara. So the midas teva shebeteva kol Yisrael betel dosam, k'may rachmanis, v'gemilas chasodim. But now he's going to contrast it. Is there another scenario? And he says, yes, there are two poles here. Just that we have Neshamas Yisrael, you also have what he's going to call nefashos of Umas Ha'elam. The nefashos of the Umas Ha'elam, of the nations of the world. So I began with an introduction last year, and I want to elaborate on that, and then we'll learn it inside. So when we talk about Havdalah, Mavdil ben Yisrael Amim, talk about the difference, the distinction, the separation between the Jewish people and the nations of the world. So we really want to base this on Torah, not based on our own stereotypes and based on our own feelings on the matter. What does the Torah say? The Torah says that until Matan Torah, we didn't yet have that Havdalah. Yes, it's true, Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov chose to connect to God, and God made a bris, a covenant with them. But it would take 7 generations from Avram till after the Jews left Mitzrayim, when they would come to Matan Torah, that we'll be celebrating literally tomorrow, where then the Eibishter would choose and become Am Yisrael. They'd go through a Gedus, a conversion, from where we learn all the halachas of Gedus, of conversion. And from there on, now you have the real distinction between Yisrael and Amim. But if you go back to Adam and Chava and Gan Eden, you don't have such a distinction. Why is this so vital to understand? Because the way God created the world, He actually made these distinctions. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is touching upon here now. To contrast that there's a nefesh habamis that comes from klipas nega, so then he goes on to say, he says, Mashenkin nefashos from Elam, he mishar klipas tmeis, she'en bem tev klal. They come from the other impure klipas, the impure shells, that do not have any good at all. But what does that mean? And that's why I'm elaborating here. What does that mean they have not good? First of all, God created them. Secondly, He created them in B'Tselem Elokim. Every human being is a child of Adam and Chava, and they were created B'Tselem. So every human being is B'Tselem Elokim. The Mishnah actually says, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, the divine image. So however you explain that, we also know that there's the concept of Chesidu Misa'elam. The Rambam brings it in Hilchos Tshuva and Hilchos Malachim, that they have a chelik le'elam haba. So not only are they righteous Gentiles of the nations of the world, they also have a chelik, they have a part in the world to come, a share in the world to come. So yes, the Tosfos says and other places that it's a different share, but they still have that. And when you look in the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Malachim, chapter 12, and he talks about what will be the situation when the Geula comes, it says, Lo yi'esek kol ha'elam, the entire business of the world be what? Lo yi'esek kol ha'elam elo dasas Hashem b'vat, only to know God. Later he says, and the Jewish people will be, the scholars will be, he distinguishes between Jews and non-Jews. But the concept, Molo Aretz Deis Hashem, that the whole world will be filled with divine knowledge, does not preclude, not exclude the nations of the world. So how we say such a statement? Ein b'hem tev klal. So firstly, let's put this back into the context of Tanya. The Tanya is coming to explain, as I said later in chapter 6 and 7, he'll explain these two types of klippas. But he comes to explain that he wants to discuss the very nature of the soul, the Jewish soul, and says there's two nefashos. So to contrast that, he says there's another type of nefesh of Umas Ha'elam. But he's not talking about an individual. He's talking about the archetype. Some call it the psychology, not the national sense of the nations of the world, but the psychology, the state goyishkeit, we can say. Because what did Matan Torah come to say? Do not be like the nations of the world. The nations of the world were pagans, and they embraced a path that's anti-godliness. And you, the Jewish people, first with Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, they chose it. Then it became formalized by Matan Torah. Do not choose that path. That's not your path. But the concept that a nation of the world, are they fundamentally going to always be pagan? Well, we see today, you see many Chesidim Misa'elam, which we'll talk about shortly. So indeed, in Rabbi Hillel Paritcha brings, in the name of the Alter Rebbe, that this part of Tanya, this section is not talking about Chesidim Misa'elam. Chesidim Misa'elam, actually come from Toiv Shebenega, Toiv of Klippas Nega. We need to discuss how is that distinguished from the animal soul of the Jew, which also comes from Toiv Klippas Nega. But that's what he says. The Tzemach Tzedek writes in this piece in Tanya, the Chassidim Misaelim come from the Odom Sheba Merkava, Pnei Odom Sheba Merkava. These are high spiritual levels. So that's not in any way contradicting the Havdalah ben Yisrael Amim. It just means that there's another category among nations of the world. The question is, how many nations are Chassidim Misaelim, how many not? So you could say, back in history, time of Avram Avinu, he was the only one. He stood up against a pagan world. Everybody was the Umasei Elam, that would go in the category of Evdi Aveda Zarah, idol worshippers. But over history, has it remained that way? And there were individuals that were Chsidu Umasei Elam, that embraced the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Neich, as the Rambam says at the end of chapter 8 of Hilchos Malachim, which what defines a Chassid Chsidu Umasei Elam, righteous Gentiles. But through history, things have changed. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, in Tovshin, especially in the 1980s, Tovshin Mem and on, discussed this at length. And what did he say? He said, the Rambam writes, in the end of chapter 8 of Hilchos Malachim, that it's a mitzvah on a Jew not just to inspire Jews, but also non-Jews to do the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Neich, to follow the 7 universal laws of civilization. And not just to follow them, but because they were given at Matan Torah. So in other words, it's not just because it rationally makes sense, just because ethical laws. Given at Matan Torah. So with that said, what does that tell us? That there is that fundamental principle. However, through the generations, the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains, it was not possible. The non-Jewish world was both aggressive, extremely anti-Semitic, to the point of persecuting the Jews or worse, and it was a sakana, a danger to even try to do such a thing. But things have changed. The Chefza Shel Elam changed. The world changed. Without going into details right now, but if you do studies, you'll see that the majority of the countries of this world today essentially embrace the principles of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Neich. Whether everyone follows it or not, that's already a question of an individual. But Umasei Elam today have a change. So what the Alter Rebbe is speaking about is the archetype that Ein Behem Tev Klal. You talk about, for example, a world where the Nazis dominated, or a world where wars dominated, a world where ethics were non-existent. Values were determined by a monarch, or by some despot, or by some dictator. This was a large part of human history, was controlled by nations of the world of that nature. So this is not the pshat that these words that the Alter Rebbe is going to say, which we're going to learn in a moment, are, God forbid, incorrect. It all comes down to when the matzav is. The Rambam writes in Sefer HaMitzvahs that today there's no mitzvah mechias Amalek, because Amalek doesn't exist anymore. So there's the mitzvah of erasing Amalek. It doesn't exist. The Torah, he asks, is nitzchi. The Torah is nitzchi. The Torah is eternal. Every mitzvah is eternal. So he says it's not the mitzvah that changed. It's the world that changed. If something doesn't exist, the mitzvah is still there. But you don't have a situation where that mitzvah needs to be implemented in a physical sense. You could talk about it spiritually, emotionally, in other ways. So the Rambam writes. And the same is true about, in general, when we talk about mitzvahs, just as using it as an example. So the question is, how many people are Chsidu Umasei Elam today? So I don't know if any of us have a clear number. You could say there was a time it was miyuta de miyuta, meaning just a few. When we're talking about just a few hundred years ago, that was the situation. And it was more of an anomaly, an exception to find Chsidu Umasei Elam. But today, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's words again, this is Malchus Shel Chesed America. Look what it's done for the Jewish people. So in general, Umasei Elam have become more refined. But this is not a contradiction at all to what it says in Tanya, because the Alter Rebbe is still talking about that archetype. And that archetype, that there's Sholosh Klippos Atmeis, and there are nefashos that come from there, holds true. The question is who to apply it to. That's not something that I don't believe we're equipped to be able to determine, because we can look at every non-Jew today and say it's potentially Chsidu Umasei Elam, or actually that way. And that answers the question. That's not a contradiction to the Chsidu Umasei Elam Yeshlam Chelik Le'elam Haba, because as the Alter Rebbe said, they come from Tev of Klippas Nega, as Rabbi Hillel brings, words of the Samach Tzedek, from Pnei Odam Sheba Merkava. And the Rambam, what he says at the end of days, he says, there's a lot more that can be said on this, but I'd like to refer you, if you want to look, there's a very powerful series of sources that explain this well in Likutei Sichos, volume 13, page 230. So there the Lubavitcher Rebbe has extensive footnotes where he discusses a Rambam. The Rambam in end of Hilchos Shmita V'Yevel says the following: Kol ish v'ish mekol boya elam asher nodva ruchei oisei. Every person, ish v'ish, from boya elam, from all the dwellers of this world, that dedicates his life, and he continues to say, to serve God, and to know God, and to follow God's straight path, and to push aside all the pettiness and superficiality of the world. I'm paraphrasing. He says, Harizen is Kadosh Kedesh Kadoshim. He's sanctified by the Holy of Holies. The Rebbe in the footnote says, Kol ish v'ish, b'kol boya elam, says the Rebbe, muchich degam ummas ha'elam b'chlal. You have to say it includes also nation, b'kol boya elam. And he goes on to bring a whole series of sources. The Hilchos Shuvin, the Hilchos Melochim. He brings the Tosfos in Avodah Zarah that says that they have a chelik b'fnei atzmei in Elam Haba. In a separate section, he brings Rabbi Hillel from that I mentioned before. But look it up because it's in very detail. Kedesh Kadoshim, well, it's not a chiddush of the Rambam because the Gemara says it. The Gemara says that Umas Elam, Akum, Shalom Atera, Harizeh, Ki'ilu K'moy Kohen Gadol Shenichnas L'fnei Nefrim. He's like the Kohen Gadol that goes into the Kedesh Kadoshim. It says elsewhere that someone, Akum, that learns Torah is chayiv, the opposite of life. So Rashi says, B'sheva mitzvahs didhu. But he's called like a Kohen Gadol that goes into the Holy of Holies. By Id Netaka says that he's even greater than a Kohen Gadol that goes into the Holy of Holies. So before we jump to conclusions about our attitude to the non-Jewish world, it's important to understand all the sources and put the Tanya in that context. I want to emphasize, this is not apologetics and it's not defensiveness, it's explaining the context of the Alter Rebbe the proper way. But the Alter Rebbe's words stand strong because the archetype still exists, the archetype of Goyishkeit. Goyishkeit is in terms of Goya Oretz, that serve either themselves or Avodah Zarah, or they serve an extension of themselves, Alikada Alikaya. The different versions, different stages of how someone does not worship Hashem Echad, that all goes into the archetype of Goya Aretz, Umas Elam. And that type of attitude, anti-God, is yes, so it comes from the Klippas, Shalosh Klippas Atmeis, like he says, from the other Klippas. He actually says the words, Meshach Klippas Tmeis, from the other Klippas, the other shells, impure shells. She'ein behem tev klal. Now we have to understand what means she'ein behem tev klal. Okay. Because here's the obvious question. What do you mean she'ein behem tev klal? Everything comes from the Eibishter. So how could it be something that in creation that she'ein behem tev doesn't have any good? So the Rabbeim or Margish this issue. The Tzemach Tzedek actually writes on this piece in Tanya, he says, meaning they're batzmusam, in other words, on their own, they don't have good. In a way that's obvious. Again, we're talking about the Shalosh Klippas Atmeis now. This is the lesson of the Tzemach Tzedek. In a state of golus, in a state of displacement or state of concealment or exile, there's of course a divine energy. Nitzutz, spark. This is the Tzemach Tzedek. The Rebbe Rashab, in several Maimorim, says that what it says in Tanya, Ein Behem Tev Klal, Ein hakavana she'ein behem shum nitzutz klal. The intention does not mean that there's no spark at all. Shari'iyah shalias kiyum shum dover bli eza nitzutz tev. Because it's impossible anything should be sustained without some good spark. Rak, so what does he mean? Shanitzutzu shenisrachek v'nechshach kol kach achu kamoira. It means that the spark has become so distant and darkened to the point that it's like kamoira, like something negative, evil. That they don't have any feeling of the divine. I mean, I'll just use a contemporary example of a black hole. What's a black hole? That the gravitational pull is so powerful it doesn't let any light escape. So this doesn't mean there's no light. Can't escape. And that's the diuk. Ein b'hem tev. Tev indicates on eir and gili, says the Rebbe Rashab. Okay. So that explains ein b'hem tev klal. Why does the Alter Rebbe not himself qualify that? Because the point he wants to make here is the antithesis, the other pole, the other end of the spectrum of nefesh habamis, of nefesh Yisrael, the nefesh habamis that comes from klipas nega. So klipas nega is also a shell, but it's a shell that's more nega, it's more transparent and more glowing, so to speak. Here, shalosh klipas atmeis is the shell is so strong it doesn't let the light out, meaning the divine spark. And then he continues the Alter Rebbe that this is not his own idea. It comes Kamesha Kosav. This says Kamesha Kosav Be'etz Chaim Shar Mem Tes Pei Gimel. So again, he gives us chapter and verse that in Eitz Chaim, which is from the Rav Chaim Vital, who wrote down the teachings of the Arizal, in Eitz Chaim, the classic Eitz Chaim, Gate 49, chapter 3. So what does he say there? What we just said, that the Shar Umas comes from Klipas Umas Shar Nefashis Umas Ha'elam comes from the Klipas Atmeis She'en B'hem Tev Klal, the other shells that don't have any goodness in them. But now we've explained it, and that context helps understand the whole picture much differently than most people read ostensibly. Okay. Then he continues, the Alter Rebbe. The chol tivu da avdin ha'umes, which comes from the Zohar. The Alter Rebbe is now quoting a Zohar, Tikkunei Zohar. Tikkunei Zohar, if you want the exact source, is 22a. She says, "V'chol tivu da avdin ha'umes," all good that the nations do, l'garmayu avdin. They do for themselves. In other words, he's qualifying. Now that you just said, in B'hem Tev Klal, there's no good. What about the good we see they do? And now we're talking not even Umas Elam, as we said before. Even at their worst, even the nations throughout history, as they behaved in that who, he said, come from the other klippas that don't have any good on their own, or not revealed or overt good. We've seen good things they've done throughout history. There wasn't all evil. So he says, L'garmayu avdin. That's the answer. They do for themselves. And that's rooted in Tikkunei Zohar, source. And the Alter Rebbe brings a Gemara. The Gemara says, Uk'd'isa b'Gemara, like it says in Gemara, the Gemara is in Baba Basra Yud Beis, 10b. What does he say in the Gemara? On the pasuk, v'chesed l'umim chatos, the pasuk in Mishlei, Yudalad Lamed Dalad. What does it say there? The pasuk says the kindness of the nations is sinful. Chesed l'umim chatos. So what does the Gemara say in this pasuk? Shekol tzedakah v'chesed she'umas ha'elam eisin. All the charity and kindness done by the nations of the world, einan ela liyisyair. They only do it to put on airs, in a sense like to boast, to show how great they are. That's what the Gemara says in Bava Basra. And here again, this of course does not apply to Chassidut Elam, because their good can be done not just for boasting, it can be done because they're deliberately trying to do something good. But here's an important point to make. Let's put it in the context of a question. You're saying they do it not for the good itself, but they do it l'garmai, for themselves. The Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva at the end, Le'elam, based on the Gemara in Kedushin, Le'elam yasek adam b'teirei mitzvah shalei l'shma. She'metech shalei l'shma bo l'shma. That a person should always be involved in Teirei mitzvah shalei l'shma, begins his work shalei l'shma, meaning for ulterior motives, and from ulterior he'll come from a selfless motive. And the Rambam says that's the order of the world, that's how people are. Because when we begin our Aveda, we're not yet on a level like that. Avram was an exception. Esa emes b'pnei shu emes. He committed to truth because it was true. But all human beings, including Jews, and it's talking there about Jews, begin shalei l'shma. So why is that different than l'gamayu? Why is that such a terrible thing? Well, first of all, there the answer is because they'll come l'shma. And there's interpreted, metech shalei l'shma, some interpret that metech, the inner pnimius, they really, as the Rambam says in Hilchos Gerish in the end of chapter 2, that really every Jew wants to do Torah mitzvahs because his nefesh is connected. As we'll learn, nefesh alikis. Even his nefesh abamis has good in it, but nefesh alikis. But so metech, the inner dimension of shalei l'shma, of an ulterior motive, is really l'shma. That you can't say on umas ha'elim that come from, that ein b'hem tev klal on their own. Secondly, you can make many distinctions, because here, even the chesed they do is for external purposes. Whereas when you talk about Eid, what we talked before, Nefesh Habam is the nature, even of his animal soul, is not for any selfish reason. It could be for being a complete human being. It's not purely for divine purposes, as we discussed. But to say that it's completely a show, that's another distinction. But with this we conclude the end of the chapter Perek Aleph, the end of the first chapter in Tanya. And to sum it up, basically, that now he's talking about, he said, began with two nefashos. We've only discussed one nefesh, the nefesh that comes from Klippas Nega, contrasted it with the archetype of nefashos of Umas Ha'elam. And the next Perek Beis, we're going to begin the nefesh Hashenis, the nefesh Alikis, the divine soul in a Jew. We've established a website, TanyaApply.com, where you can ask any question and also see the archives of previous classes. With that, let me wish you all Kabbalah Satera B'Simcha B'Pnimius Matan Teda. 3,333 years ago, we received the Teda at Sinai. May we merit to receive Teda Chadosh Shemiti Teitze as we march from Matan Teda into the Gula Hamitis Vashlema. Good Yontif to everyone. I look forward to see you next week.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.